I have a deep, dark secret. Every day when I'm working a shift, I'm shocked that they're willing to let me be a doctor. In fact, every time I order Tylenol, I'm waiting for someone to swoop down and say to me, "You can't do that. You're not a real doctor." I thought I was totally alone in feeling like this, but it turns out I'm not. This feeling of being found out as a fraud is actually a well-documented phenomenon amongst many high-achieving individuals. For example, someone once said, "I've written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find me out now." She was just Pulitzer Prize nominee and Grammy Award winner Maya Angelou, who also won a Presidential Medal of Honor for her poetry. Here's another such individual who said, "I'd wake up in the morning before going off to a shoot and think, I can't do this. I'm a fraud." Shortly after this quote, Kate Winslet won an Oscar for Best Actress. It turns out this phenomenon has a name and it's been well studied for over 3 decades. It's known as imposter syndrome, and it's what I'm here to talk to you about today. By the end of this lecture, I hope you'll be able to walk away with a sense of what imposter syndrome is, decide if it's something that's affecting you, and if so, what strategies you can employ to prevent imposter syndrome from affecting you and your work. First of all, what the heck is imposter syndrome? It's the term used to designate an internal experience of intellectual phoniness. It was first coined by clinical psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in 1978. While working with over 150 successful college-aged women, they started noticing a trend. These women were unable to internalize their accomplishments and had a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. These women were all what we'd consider to be high-achieving individuals with great standardized test scores, continued academic excellence, and a demonstrated record of leadership. But they all expressed fears that they just, quote unquote, weren't good enough. Clance and Imes noted that despite external evidence of their competence, those who exhibited what they deemed imposter syndrome remained convinced they were frauds and undeserving of the success they had achieved. When presented with proof of their success, it was dismissed as luck, timing, or the result of deceiving others into thinking that they were more intelligent and competent than they believed themselves to be. Imposter syndrome is not classified as a psychiatric disorder, and it's not in the DSM-10. It was initially perceived to be an ingrained personality trait, but now it's recognized as a reaction to certain situations that can be unhealthy. Let me introduce you to the vicious cycle of imposter syndrome. When faced with any new challenge, the imposter is convinced they are incapable of meeting that challenge. They rise to the occasion and, upon self-reflection, realize that they were actually able to achieve this discrete goal. However, and this is the crucial component, they can't internalize that achievement for future challenges that they might face. There's a few characteristics that those afflicted with imposter syndrome have, and all these components just make it harder for those afflicted to overcome this syndrome. First, imposter syndrome sufferers tend to be diligent because they feel like they have to work really, really, really hard to prevent people from discovering that they're a fraud. Their diligence leads to more achievements, but these achievements only cause them to feel like more of a fraud. They're often really good at reading people and good at knowing what people want to hear. Because they're not confident in their own worth, they might give answers that they think people want rather than their true opinions. This further perpetuates feelings of being a fraud. They're charming, But even this is detrimental because they feel like the praise they receive is based on their charm rather than ability. Finally, people with imposter syndrome also avoid displaying confidence because believing in their abilities creates another situation for rejection. By doing this continues to perpetuate imposter syndrome because that lack of self-confidence is eventually internalized until you believe that you are not worth anything. So, who gets imposter syndrome? There are certain characteristics and life experiences that make people more prone to imposter feelings or to experience them more intensely. Self-identified imposters are often in professions different from the rest of their family. Their career orientation is different from their parents, and they're first-generation college students. They're the first to attend professional school. Basically, they're the black sheep of their families, and they're doing something drastically different from what they were expected to do. While we once thought that imposter syndrome was more common in women who are successful than their careers, it's now been shown to occur equally in men, particularly minority men. This may be because women, minorities, and other disenfranchised individuals are more socialized in many realms to exist at the base of the power hierarchy. This results in the thinking that you're more likely to believe you're undeserving of your success if subconsciously you've been told by society that who you are and your identity is undeserving of your success. Who cares if you have imposter syndrome? Many people will tell me this when I initially tell them about this phenomenon. It certainly sounds better than the alternative. You think you're great when you're actually terrible at your job, and nobody wants that. The problem with imposter syndrome is that, first, constantly feeling like you're a fraud is exhausting. Secondly, it makes it so that you are unable to take pride in your work. This can lead to burnout, since an important component to preventing burnout is the ability to find satisfaction in your work. Constantly feeling like a fraud makes it so that you have trouble recognizing your achievements and internalizing your successes. It might lead you to ask, what's the point of doing the work that I do? Here are some other ways that imposter syndrome is detracting from your job satisfaction. Because you never believe in your capabilities, you're incapacitated by the fear of failure. You end up not taking on new opportunities because it's just another stage for you to be exposed. Of course, it's normal to be fearful of failure, but the problem arises when we give those fears the power to keep us from taking the actions that are necessary to achieve our goals and aspirations. If this puppy had imposter syndrome, he would not be able to take this flying leap off the couch and give us this wonderful, wonderful GIF. So, imposter syndrome is a problem. You might be asking yourself, what can I do about it? Am I doomed to be terrified for the rest of my life, hoping to not be found out? This is where I like to remind myself that imposter syndrome isn't a personality trait, but rather it's a reaction to certain situations. And because it's a conditioned reaction, you can teach yourself to adapt or at least modulate your reactions so that you're no longer held back by this nagging thought that you are a total fraud. So what's the most important thing to combat imposter syndrome? Just talk about it. Recognize that imposter syndrome is a real feeling which affects many people. It's totally normal, and the next time you feel like you're a fraud, remind yourself that you are in excellent company. I can't tell you how many times when I've talked about being a giant fake the conversation turns into a chorus of me toos. It turns out everyone is just waiting for someone to talk about it, and it might as well be you. Next, to combat imposter syndrome, make a list of your accomplishments. Remind yourself that every single individual has things that they're good at, and regardless of how trivial they are, you should practice taking pride in them. Remind yourself of the skills you have, but also the skills you want to develop. This gives you a much more realistic perception of your achievements. So, for example, when I was in my second year of medical school, I felt like a complete idiot and that I was incapable of learning the absurd amount of medical knowledge that I would have to know to become a doctor. To make myself feel better, I made a list of things that I knew I was good at. Sure, maybe I'd never be able to memorize the coagulation cascade, but I knew without a doubt that I was very good at moisturizing. Recognize that life is a process. In fact, there's something to be said for not being an expert in something. Oftentimes, being a novice in something gives you fresh perspective, and that just because you don't know everything there is to know about something doesn't mean you can't contribute to the conversation. The final step requires an element of self-acceptance, and this is definitely the hardest part. It involves coming to terms with the fact that you don't have to attain perfection or mastery to be worthy of the success you've achieved. Instead of reaching for an impossible bar, reset your own expectations for yourself to a realistic level that doesn't leave you forever striving and feeling inadequate. So, I don't know if I'll fully be able to ever get over my feelings of being an imposter. In fact, I felt like a little bit of an imposter giving this very lecture because I certainly am not an expert on it. But in my greatest moments of self-doubt, I try to remember the words of fellow imposter syndrome sufferer Tina Fey. She says, "The beauty of imposter syndrome is you facilitate between extreme egomania and a complete feeling of I'm a fraud. Oh God, they're onto me. I'm a fraud." So you just try to ride the egomania when it comes and enjoy it and slide through the idea of fraud. Hopefully, I've now given you a few tips that you'll be equipped to make that ride a little bit smoother.